I'd like to welcome now this evening our 190 strong live audience scattered throughout Ireland and parts of the United Kingdom. Céad Míle Fáilte Romh, 100,000 welcomes to you. Joe Berry is going to join us for a panel discussion, which will include 4 other panelists who've had their unique experiences of suffering the pain of bereavement and difficulties in violence, or have worked closely with people who have suffered in that way. Firstly, Senator Emer Currie, a native of Dunamore in County Tyrone, where violent groups attacked her family largely because of her father, Austin's leading role in establishing the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. Aged 11, Emer moved with her family to West Dublin, where her father became a representative of the Fine Gael party in the Dáil. Emer has followed in her father's footsteps, but not into the Dáil, into the Seanad instead, where she has Fine Gael's spokesperson now on employment affairs, work-life balance in Northern Ireland. From East Belfast, we're joined by Alan McBride, who has long advocated for victims and survivors of the Northern Ireland Troubles. In 1993, Alan's wife Sharon and her father Desmond Frizzell were killed by the IRA when it bombed Frizzell's fish shop in the loyalist Shankill Road. He said in a recent interview that he had not gone soft on or forgiven the IRA or Gerry Adams, who subsequently carried the coffin of one of the bombers who also perished in the blast. But I sort of understood, he said, that if they'd grown up in any other part of the United Kingdom, they probably wouldn't have done the things that they did. Alan coordinates the Wave Trauma Centre in Belfast. From Dublin, we're joined by Fardus Sultan, who's a Muslim activist. She's a native of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where she was a survivor of the Bosnian War. In a few weeks, her city will mark the 25th anniversary of the ending of a 44-month-long siege, where 11,500 people, mostly Muslims, died. They had been shelled and sniped upon by Bosnian Serbs in the surrounding mountains and hills. Fardus came to Ireland as a child during the early months of that siege and has a degree in politics and Arabic and a master's in cyber psychology, which she teaches. She helped to found the Sisters of Faith and Peace organization and is a board member of Muslim Primary Education Board. Finally, Helen Henderson joins us from Limavady, not far from her native city, which the broadcaster Gerry Anderson once famously called Stroke City, Derry, Londonderry. Gerry obviously had reconciliation and peace in mind when he coined that one. Helen is the current managing director of St. Colum's Park House, a peace and reconciliation centre based in the capital of the Northwest. Previously, she coordinated the development education work of the organisation Children in Crossfire. Recently, she was appointed to Northern Ireland's Human Rights and Equality Commission, but she's here this evening in her personal capacity. So let's begin with the panel. May I ask Alan McBride, perhaps? Alan, would you like to tell us, when we talk about reconciliation, what do you think we mean?
I suppose just at a very basic level, we mean building relationships between people who were formerly divided. And I think in that sense, reconciliation here in Northern Ireland and in the island of Ireland is greatly needed.
Could I put that same question to Emer Currie? What do you think we're talking about when we discuss reconciliation?
Hello, everybody, and thanks for having me. Thanks for the question, Joe, and it was wonderful to hear from you, Joe Berry, about your story. Reconciliation for me is about coming to terms, I think, with the past. So for me, it is both a personal journey. I think everyone will have their own unique relationship with reconciliation depending on their experiences. And then, of course, there's how we encourage communities and society through the process of politically through the process of reconciliation, which is very difficult. But it is for me about coming to terms with the past, and you may not, you can accept it, but you can't change it, and just being able to move on without, I suppose, reliving trauma.
Helen Henderson, if you can hear me in Limavady, can you tell me what you think we're talking about when we discuss reconciliation?
We started to understand a more holistic sense of reconciliation that looks at 3 layers: reconciliation within ourselves, and that's really about understanding our complicity with racism, sectarianism, and how I've benefited from that. It's also about the self-compassion. Reconciliation with others as the second layer, and that's really about that practice of peace and non-violence in my daily life. So how in our daily lives we can appreciate our connection and interdependence, and how we can have compassion, or try and have compassion, for perceived enemies. And the final layer that we started to dig a little bit at was that reconciliation with the land, with our natural environment. And that was reconnecting with our natural environment. It was also looking at, I suppose, a conflict that maybe started with land a long time ago, and really going back to the root causes of the conflict. And as Rumi says, sometimes we're looking for the branches, looking in the branches for things that can only be found in the roots. So we just started to dig a little bit more into what are the roots, and we started to dig up some of our own dark roots that connect us to colonialism, individualism, and this extractive relationship with our earth. So this sounds very broad, but that was the direction we started to take, looking at reconciliation within ourselves, with others, and with our natural environment. So thank you.
Fardus Sultan, what's your take on what reconciliation is?
Good evening, all. Well, I have to agree. It's with many of the panelists, and particularly with Joe. I think it's very much it's personal take, but it's also I think it also takes a cultural and a historical context as well. It's not. It's the meaning of reconciliation. Reconciliation is not necessarily universal, and it has that kind of cultural and political aspects as well. Certainly, for me, I always tend to look at myself, what it is that I can do to affect a change in the society. But at the same time, I think reconciliation really it also needs the support of the other structures, need support of the government, of the entire society, really. Because oftentimes there is an assumption that as soon as the conflict ends, that suddenly the peace will prosper, the society will prosper. And that's really not the case. It's only that when violence and the war stops, that victims have the opportunity to deal with their emotional trauma. And sometimes we talk about community trauma as well. So we really need to address the issues that that started, if you like, the conflict, or the issues that were used to escalate that. So we need to look in ourselves, but also in the society, and ask for the support of the society, because in as much as we can change ourselves, we have to seek support of like-minded individuals and also people, organizations in power. So it's oftentimes it's both. I think it's both. I like both approaches. I like carrot and stick. So I think, both retributional justice and restorative justice have a place to play, a role to play in reconciliation, and they're quite important. But again, I think we all take the meaning from our own personal life.
Alan McBride, must reconciliation achieve a goal, a tangible goal within a certain period in order to be real? Or can it just be a continuous process at a very low level in society?
I think for me, it's a continual process. I mean, I don't ever imagine we'll come to the place where everybody on this island is reconciled, and I think that people go very much at their own pace. So when I was listening to Jo, a lady who I've met many times and always inspired by her and by her story, and I've met Patrick as well. I've had a few pints with him down in various bars around Belfast, and I suppose to some people that would be reconciliation of a sort. I mean, Patrick didn't kill my loved one, but he was part of an organisation that did, and yet I was able to go and have a drink with him. And I know that there are people in my community and people even within my family that would find that almost impossible to even countenance that I could do that. And I mean, I've met Jerry Adams as well, and over many years, and I've had people call me a traitor, and that I've betrayed my wife's memory. I mean, I'm actually very struck when Jo was talking about people accusing her of betraying her father's memory. I mean, I've had similar accusations leveled at me as well, and I would never say that those people that are hurling those accusations that they're wrong, because they're in the particular place where they're at. And I think that we all need at our own pace to try and bring people along with us. I'll tell you one of the most memorable stories, and I share this a lot these days, that I had in my own journey. Whenever Sharon was murdered in 1993 by the IRA, I lived in a loyalist housing estate. I was there for about a year, and when I got some compensation money, I was able to move out of there, and I bought a house in a mixed area because I wanted my daughter to know, Catholics and Protestants. And so she became really good friends with a couple of little girls across the street, and I, as a result of that, became really good friends with their parents, who were both Roman Catholics. And I can remember one 11th night that they were. Her father, these little girls' father, came over to the house and invited me over to their house for a party. And I always go around the bonfires on the 11th night as part of my culture, something that I don't believe that Irish nationalists ever really quite understand. I mean, the 11th of July and the 12th of July was like Christmas Day for me. Growing up, it was one of the things I looked forward to most in life. And even as an adult, I still go. And so I was looking forward to going around the fires. And he asked me to go to this barbecue. And I sort of tried to make an excuse to get out of it. My daughter wanted to go to play with her friends. So we ended up going over to the house across the street, this Roman Catholic's house. And when I got there, they had the barbecue going, and they had actually built a small bonfire in their back garden for me. There was no Irish tricolour on this bonfire. There was no effigy of the Pope or of Jerry Adams. We sat around the fire, we told stories, we drank beer, our kids played in the garden, and little Catholic girls, little Protestant girls. And I'll tell you, there's nothing more beautiful than the sound of children laughing. And for me, coming away that night, I thought, that's a real glimpse of, for me, what reconciliation is. But then the big question is, what do we need to do in our society to take us there? How can we build that mutual respect for each other's culture and each other's tradition? Because when I go to bonfires, usually you have the party tunes, you have people very drunk, singing anti-Catholic, anti-Republican, anti-nationalist songs, and it's all part of a festival. And and maybe I'm guilty because I'm there. I'm guilty by association. So I think we've got a hell of a long way to go in our society before we can actually start to see those relationships normalize. But that's a little picture for me of reconciliation.
Currie, there's a picture of your mother, Anita, having been very badly beaten around the face with two of her little toddlers. I think the picture was taken a few days after the event. This was in the early days of the civil rights campaign, when your parents were living in Donaghmore in Tyrone. Your father subsequently became a member of the power sharing executive in 1974. It must have been a bitter pill for your mother to swallow, that the political forces which turned blind eyes and the social forces which turned blind eyes to the intimidation and beating of your mother then had to be accommodated in a political executive.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that when listening to Jo, when she was talking about individuals, seeing the individual behind, I suppose, the identity that we might see in a uniform or through a name that isn't, part of our community. My parents weren't like that. My mom and dad, reared us to always see the individuals. And I can remember British soldiers standing outside on the road, having the helicopters arrive into the fields beside us, and then coming up to the front of our house to where the RUC would have lived in the, or would have been stationed in the 1970s, because we needed police protection, and they lived in our house. Our garage was renovated into a place for them to be, and their own space. And actually, it's funny that the things that happen when you become, I suppose, a public figure. I had an email from a man that was one of the RUC men in the garage, and I always wondered, Mommy, how did you cope whenever you had 3 kids under 3? You had been through what you had been through when she was attacked that night, and it wasn't just her face that had been attacked. She was, attacked in an awful way. I mean, they carved UVF on her breasts that particular night, and so they did. They had police protection living in the house, but he sent me an email, and he said how kind my parents were, and that they felt part of the family, and that even stories that they have forgotten, that they had played poker with them, and my mom was younger than me at the time, and she made them part of her family. And these are things that they don't, so much happen to my parents that they don't even remember all of this. And I just felt so proud of them that's what I had been reared in. And now I have a family of my own, and I have 2 wee girls, and I'm married to somebody who's Church of Ireland. We are an interfaith family. I have a wee girl who's Catholic and a wee girl who's Church of Ireland, and that means so much to me that I took the decision that I wanted that for them, that when they're old enough to realize the significance of that will be, it's meaningful for me and meaningful for them.
Can I call Helen in on that particular one, because you've just recalled quite a number of experiences of childhood and the psychological impact of violence and conflict. Helen, you've worked quite a lot with young people in Northern Ireland in this whole area of reconciliation and peace building. How do the psychological impacts of that kind of politically rationalized violence that Anita Currie suffered, how do they affect the conditions for reconciliation?
Well, I think I've worked a lot in communities that still suffer violence on a fairly regular basis. And the young people in those communities are often demonized and blamed for that violence. And I always think that they feel very voiceless. They feel that they are forgotten about and they don't have a say, and that they didn't really benefit from what was, labeled as the peace process. There also is a lot of trauma that Alan will know a lot more about it than me, but how that manifests itself with young people in terms of their mental health and their physical health, and just the general coping mechanisms that people use then, maybe the parents that are suffering from PTSD, and how that, addictions and different issues. But what's really interesting, and I'm always conscious not to, what I do see is a lot of communities are stereotyped because they've been through a lot, and there's a lot of trauma concentrated in a small area. So I'm conscious not to stereotype, because what I do see in those communities is amazing resilience, and kids that really want to know how to make a difference. They want to get involved. They want to help organize the bonfire in a way that's peaceful and it doesn't offend. But very often, they're undermined by other issues and lack trust with a lot of the statutory organizations. So when we talk about building those relationships between people, there's a horizontal part of that, but there's a vertical part where feedback mechanisms, where those young people can have their voice heard and their rights met, the very basic rights, like their rights to education, to decent housing, and the rights to have a say in things that affect them. So That's what I've seen at a community level.
Fardus, can you tell us what happens when sectarianism and racism interact in the way that they have done in your home city, your native city?
Having experienced the war and living under the siege of Sarajevo during my kind of teen years, what was most horrific, I think, for most of us was getting to the grips that our next door neighbors, the people who knew us all our lives, who grew up with us, worked with us, celebrated with us and so on, that they could suddenly turn to ourselves and commit those horrific crimes against humanity. So I think, you know, what it does, I think it affects people in that there is the sense of definitely loss of trust, and for the victims, I think dealing with the effects of war and violence, there is the need for justice. There is need for closure and an opportunity for people kind of to voice their grievances in a peaceful, in a protective environment. So I think that's, you know, and oftentimes when people talk about especially reconciliation in Bosnia, they often mention the Peace and Truth Tribunal, where victims and perpetrators alike can express their views and their experiences. So I think, you know, when we and in terms of the racism and sectarianism, there are many similarities, certainly, and while racism is more visible because oftentimes it targets people by because they tend to be different race, nationality, and culture, sectarianism is much more covert, but the results of that are still the same for the victims. So I think it's important to address the issues and really kind of to listen to people who have experienced those violence, but also to address the issues that have the underlying causes of both, if you like, sectarianism and racism, both at a societal level as well as individual.
Yeah, bring Joe Berry in here. Joe, many conflict zones in the world have studiously avoided what Bosnia found itself doing, and that was participating in the war trials, the war crimes trials in The Hague. Is there an argument for making people amenable for war crimes? Does that help in any way to prepare the ground for a society where people can live together, the air having been cleared, as it were?
I agree with Fardus that we have to have justice for reconciliation. That I mean, I know when I was in Bosnia, I was just struck with how many victims they were still trying to identify where the bodies were, their loved ones. The basic needs hadn't been met, and there was very little support for any kind of victim support. Like, I mean, Northern Ireland has some fantastic programs, and there's very little of that in Bosnia. So people there are very much at the beginning of the journey. So there's so many needs not being met, and certainly we can't enforce any kind of reconciliation on people. It has to grow out of a need of the victims. And I know in Rwanda, where the Gacaca courts was a kind of justice, restorative justice, but some of the victims felt that was imposed on them and they hadn't gone through the anger. It was almost like forgiveness was imposed. So I know I haven't quite answered your question, but I think so many things have to be in place. And of course, justice is hugely important. But as to what is justice, that's going to mean, you know, different depending on the community. And when a whole community is, as we talked about, is traumatized, that healing is going to take a very long time, and a lot of needs has to be met.
And if I may bring Alan McBride in here, of course, the sticking point in Northern Ireland in this sphere has been the delays in awarding pensions to casualties of conflict and associated issues. That really is a very difficult circle to square, isn't it? Given the positions that are quite, universal on either side of the community.
Well, I think it is, and I think on the pensions issue, I mean that's a campaign which I have led for the past 11 years in relation to the We Have Injured group, and I suppose in what has gone on there, you just kind of see the difficulties around dealing with the past in a nutshell, if you like, because for 7 or 8 years we were up and down to Stormont trying to get our MLAs on board with us, and absolutely every MLA agreed that a pension for injured victims of the conflict was a good idea. It came down to Sinn Féin, the DUP, who couldn't basically agree around eligibility. And when you kind of step back from this a wee bit, and I looked at the arguments, I could sort of see that there was morality in what both organizations were saying. I mean, Sinn Féin were saying, look, we will never leave a wounded soldier behind on the battlefield, and for their perspective, that's what they've been arguing for. But for the same time, the DUP were saying, well, look, we're not going to be giving pensions to people who blew themselves up planting bombs. And you could sort of see there's kind of a strange morality in both of those arguments. And so it didn't go anywhere. And it wasn't until the Assembly collapsed, actually, that became the opportunity for us to take the campaign to Westminster. And it was Westminster MPs that got it over the line. And now let's hope that the pension will be delivered. Of course, we had to delay because Sinn Féin weren't happy with the fact that it was through no fault of your own, and they kept arguing that everybody should be included, and so the pension was delayed. But I think in that whole issue around the pension, it really does encapsulate the difficulties in dealing with the past here, because you have two communities, two large political parties with a very different interpretation and narrative of what went on here. And to be quite honest with you, I don't think that those two parties are capable actually of coming together and having an agreed way forward in relation to our past. So I suspect the past is something that's always going to evade us a little bit, and that's sad, because I think that we need to build in Northern Ireland on a proper process where we've actually, we've exercised our demons, we've explored our truths, we've come up with solutions, we've reached out to victims and survivors, and we've tried to bring people on board. But I suspect we're going to have to. And here's the question for other panelists. Can you really build reconciliation in the absence of a proper process that deals with the past? Because that's the thing that has evaded us up to now.
But if I may put a version of that to Emer Currie, with all the blemishes in the efforts to reconcile the past in Northern Ireland, the current government has launched the Shared Island Initiative. What are the openings there, do you think? What could be built reasonably ambitiously in order to consolidate reconciliation which has been achieved to date, and to build peace in a more secure way?
Well, I think one of the problems that we have is what's happening with the Stormont House Agreement, and that would have been with the Stormont House Agreement. It's part of the New Decade, New Approach that was agreed. It was agreed that within 100 days that would be work would start, and then we had the announcement in March of a new direction, and we haven't really seen much from it yet. But what the Shared Island does, I think, is we have to, accept that whenever we didn't have an executive for 3 years, and we lost the North-South Ministerial Council, and we weren't, there wasn't enough, I suppose, interaction, north-south and east-west, and with everything that has gone on with Brexit, things have moved on, and I think what the shared unit attempts and hopefully will do is to start more civic dialogue outside of just politicians, and it's putting money behind it as well, which is important, and there's 500 million there, and it takes us out into actually working on projects together in terms of roads and greenways and hopefully high-speed rail. You know, there's a commitment there around climate and research and education. So I think you know, it's a very positive step, but it should also be seen within the context of the Good Friday Agreement and the potential of the Good Friday Agreement.
We have a question from Anne Walker, who is in our invited audience. Anne says, my question is for Joe Berry. In regards to the re-traumatizing when working with people who are ready to get involved in peace, self-help and so on, re-traumatizing is practically unavoidable. Is there any way to use or manage trauma to aid healing?
Oh, thank you, Anne. Brilliant question. And I'm pretty sure all the panels, everyone will have an answer to that because of the amazing work you're all doing. I mean, I know that when I have my hat on as a restorative justice facilitator, which is work I absolutely love to do, we do so much work on safety. You know, we never bring people together unless we know it's safe for them to have the conversation, and there's so much preparation, there's so much support. And I worked with homicide cases where in the beginning it didn't look like it was ever going to happen. A year later, I brought two people together, a victim and someone who killed her father. And I just remember this young woman, after years process of working with us, she stopped having the nightmares. She felt empowered. She could speak. She got her voice. She got her life back. And it was done with so much safety. So I think that with the right kind of support, and of course what I did was without any kind of preparation or support. And I took a risk because that's just how I was at the time. But I think we can minimize that aspect of re-traumatizing, you know, and also people do know what they need. You know, I've worked with people who say, right now I need to take a step back. I can't talk anymore. And that's fine. Everyone's doing this out of choice, not because they have to. And we have to be totally aware and sensitive to people's needs.
Gabriel Brocklesby has a question about precisely the reaction of families to this work in reconciliation. And I know Joe has spoken about this already, but if I may go to Alan. Alan, you've spoken about your mother-in-law's reaction to your efforts to build reconciliation. And you've accepted that there are different ways for different individuals to respond to the kind of trauma that the Frizzell family and your family experienced.
Yeah, I mean, we lost Elsie very sadly at the start of COVID. She was almost 90 years old, and her and I were very dear friends, really on the back of the trauma and the tragedy, because I stayed very, very connected to Sharon's family. In fact, I actually lived with Sharon's sister and husband for 2 years, actually slept on their sofa until I regained my strength a little bit to be able to move on. So Elsie was always somebody, a very, very important person in my life, but she was someone who was very, very different to me, and she never ever really spoke about what happened at the Shankill bomb. Apart, I have to say to you, for a meeting she was at Glencree, actually, I think was one of the very few times that she actually spoke about what happened on the Shankill bomb, and she had left that day of the bomb to step out to get some messages. She was coming up the Shankill Road when the bomb went off, so she saw, the bomb go off, her daughter, her husband murdered, and then she saw Gerry Adams carry the coffin, and so she was someone who really had a very deep hatred and dislike of Gerry Adams, as did I have to say to you, for many years. In fact, I campaigned way before I became Alan McBride, the peace builder. I mean, I was Alan McBride, the angry victim that was standing outside Sinn Féin offices and chasing Gerry Adams around Dublin, Washington, Boston, New York, before I had my own kind of transformative experience. And so what happened then was I was asked to actually meet with Gerry Adams to do a program for Channel 4 looking at Jesus Christ, believe it or not, and they were actually looking at it through the eyes of famous politicians, and he was one of the ones that was chosen. And so they asked if I would go on the program with them, and I sort of thought about it, spoke to a good friend of ours, Harold Good, and I decided, maybe it's time now to just have that conversation with Gerry Adams. So I actually met with Gerry Adams privately before I did the program, and the BBC got wind of it, and they wanted me to do an interview on it. They were going to tell the story. This is before the program was going to go out, and I sort of thought my mother-in-law would have had time to, we get through Christmas, and then I could tell her what happened, because I knew it was always going to be a difficult conversation. But I didn't get the chance to tell her, and the story broke, and she was absolutely beside herself with rage. I can remember my sister-in-law phoning me and telling me, look, Mum wants to talk to you, or doesn't want to talk to you, in fact just want to see you again. I don't know what you've done, but you've really, really hurt her. And I remember calling up to the house, and she'd been in bed all day, and when she came down in her dressing gown, and her eyes were just, she was just sobbing the whole day, and she just screamed at me, and just basically, she says, how could you dishonor my daughter's memory so much, and how could you hurt me so badly that, by meeting this man, this and it was, and the next day, actually, as misfortune would have it, I was having a book launch for a book that I was working on, and I'd actually invited Gerry Adams to it, and my mother-in-law was coming to the same event, and I was hoping and praying that Gerry Adams wouldn't turn up, and he did turn up, and I was in this meeting with, and they were basically glaring at each other from Elsie was glaring at him, and so it's extremely, I can remember another time when I was asked to give the Bloody Sunday lecture in Derry, my dad phoning me up and basically saying, look, what are you doing? And, and him and I had a big fallout about that. He sort of thought I was being brainwashed. So, when you put your head above the parapet and you come from a community that is, my community is loyalist, is unionist, is hardcore. My dad was in the UDA, my uncles were in the Orange Order. And when I start reaching out the hand of friendship, or try to understand people, the likes of Gerry Adams, and it's probably okay to reach a hand out to people like John Hume, and I have a great fan of John Hume, but John Hume's probably always going to be acceptable to unionists. Gerry Adams was never going to be, and so when I did that, it really did come back to bite me. That said, would I do it again? Yes, I probably would. Maybe I would have spent longer preparing Elsie for it, because I believe in the journey that I was on, but maybe not dissimilar from the journey that Joe was on. It was a wee bit about developing that understanding. But the other thing, and I'll finish with this, sometimes to be held up then as an example, as some people did, there's others that say, well, you know what, if that's an example, we don't believe that what you did was right, and we certainly wouldn't be following your example. So even being held up as this kind of example, for some people I'm a great peace builder, for others I'm an absolute traitor, and people think both things about me.
Well, this is probably reflected in Sean Feenan's question, another member of the audience. Recognizing that reconciliation is a very personal journey for many, Sean wants to ask Joe Berry if it helped in some way that Patrick McGee had served time for the Brighton bombing and her father's death. Obviously, if he had not done time, you would never have known of his involvement, and so you would never have met him, it seems quite probable. My question to all the panel members is, how do we help the reconciliation and legacy process when perpetrators have not been identified and families do not have the similar closure? Would you like to take that up, Helen Henderson?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult question. There's so much hurt out there, and there's so many people who maybe have not engaged in some of the victim support services that Joe talked about, and are still very silent and very traumatized. And I think maybe some of the things that may help, obviously the justice and remedy for what has happened, even if the perpetrators cannot be identified, but maybe some remedy through the sort of rehabilitation and support. Yeah, it's a really difficult one, but I do think there are a significant number of people that haven't had their voice heard, and obviously the actions taken and the lack of delivery of Stormont House Agreement is another hurt for victims and survivors. So I think some progress and some political will would really help. And coming from a human rights angle, that human rights are there for everybody. They're there to hold people to account. And I think that's a way that consistently over time that people can see that in the future. That would be good.
Another question from a member of the audience. Hi, Brian Whelan here. Thanks for this wonderful panel discussion. Could I ask the panel how important they feel it is for these types of discussions and talks to take place in schools? We learn about the history of countries, conflicts, events, etc., but very rarely teach or are taught about the human side of these events. Fardus, what's your reflection on that?
Yeah, that's a really a fantastic comment and observation, and I think that's one of the I would say important. That would be one of the key initiatives in my view is really to address that with the younger generation, so they themselves are aware of that what's happening across the world or next door. It really impacts people on a human level. And I think the education goes a long way to make people human again, because oftentimes due to this very inflammatory language and polarized media and narrative, we have kind of this there is this separation between us and them. But it's important to understand that we are all in this together in a way, but also to when we are hurt, we also bleed. And the color, despite of our religious, national, ethnic, racial, and so on differences, color of blood is the same. It's universal. So rather than and then seeing what it is that how different we are, and I think we should celebrate this diversity, because how boring our lives would be if we're all alike, even with our own families or our country. So it's great that we're all different, but at the same time that despite our differences, that we all have very, very similar human aspirations, human dreams, and human fears as well. And oftentimes the conflicts people who, speaking from my own experiences, Serbian leaders who explored this, and they explored the issues in history, they've actually made their own kind of people fear an enemy that wasn't there really. So so the idea is really that we should really make sure that our younger generations are aware of our similarity despite our own differences, and really, in youth. Hopefully the answer lies. So yeah, definitely I would love to see that that discussion brought to schools.
Thank you, Martin Long says, for our wonderful panel and your powerful testimonies. May I ask you, if achieving reconciliation is too ambitious in the context of Ireland, will every proposition for stability suggested by Dublin, for example, such as the Shared Island Initiative, be considered as a Trojan horse? In other words, ought energies be directed away from the goal of reconciliation and instead be focused on nurturing an uneasy but permanent peace? Would you like to take that up, Emer Currie?
I think if you want that version of peace, you need reconciliation. And that is, to me, the most important aspect of all of our work. And while people do want to concentrate, I suppose, on constitutional issues, and they very validly, for me, the priority is about reconciliation and finding peace of mind, and that I just can't imagine that a version of that without reconciliation, and that has to enable people to talk their truth. We have to be able to build empathy, And so, yeah, to me, that it is, reconciliation is the most important thing, because it's not just about our generation, it's about intergenerational trauma. So I think it's a very interesting question, but I think this is the route that we have to take, which is about building bridges and reconciliation.
Thank you very much, Emer. Roger Childs, former colleague of mine in RTE. Roger asks, do any of your panelists have suggestions about how to resolve the current impasse that exists between France's enshrinement of the Je suis Charlie free speech campaign and the demand of many Muslims not to see their most precious beliefs mocked and their religious observance restricted? I don't know if Fardus wants to take that, or maybe Joe Berry, who has witnessed these kinds of tensions as well. Would either or both of you like to go with an answer there?
Yes, I mean, really, we all know the importance of free speech, and I think it's one of our democratic and human rights. It's quite important to understand its value in the society, in every society. But we also have to have a balance between the incitement to hatred or inflammatory language as well, that is not really of benefit to anyone, and to be also respectful of importance of particular issues within whether it's ethnic group, whether it's religious group, and so on. So sometimes, so I think provoking for the sake of provoking and getting the answer, I think it's very much lowballing. I don't think it's certainly not a measure. It's not a reflection of a mature democratic society, and it's certainly an offensive speech is not really what a free speech should be about. So equally, I mean, I'm as a person of faith and a person who experienced the war, I'm extremely and speaking for many of my Muslim friends, we are against violence, against the terrorism. So it's not endorsing; it's endorsing that, but certainly it's important to have the balance in terms of the language on things, reporting, so that that the people work together to bring resolution, not to pitch one side against the other. So just leave it to Joe to perhaps add to that.
Joe, politics and religion were always a very difficult cocktail in revolutionary France. It's a very difficult cocktail in contemporary France. Do you see any way around the so-called clash of cultures and the spiraling downwards of relations in countries like France?
I'm not an expert. I don't live in France, but I would like to add to what Fardus said, that it's so important after these attacks to not then demonize and blame all Muslims, which does happen, and the media has a part to play in how they kind of can make people feel outraged, and to remember that this is a tiny minority, and there's always kindness around these acts. There's always people who behave in an incredible, fantastically full of humanity ways, and that's what we need to talk about when you talk about the victims and their stories. You talk about the people who were there, who went out of their way to support and help. And there's actually incredible work in France in the Muslim community, addressing the needs and creating bridges. So that structure, that infrastructure, just needs to be supported, and take away from this idea that I know some people believe, that all Muslims are terrorists, and then Muslims have such a backlash every time something happens, an attack happens, and that's not okay. That's really, really not okay. And I remember after an appalling attack in London, I was in Edinburgh, and there was a young Muslim couple in the hotel, and I went up to them and I said, I just want you to know that I'm here for you. You know, right now it could be a bit scary for you. How are you doing? And they were just amazed. So, you know, we can all refuse to believe the demonization and the scapegoating. And of course, there was a time when all Irish were seen as terrorists, you know, and that's not okay. You know, all blacks are seen as another way. And that's what we have to guard about. And Helen talked about that at the beginning, about how it starts inside ourselves. We need to be aware when the media is making us feel that a whole community is wrong. And we need to be absolutely sure that we are not buying into that, and we're seeing individuals all the time.
Thank you, Joe. Brona Katabusic speaks as someone who grew up on the Irish border during the Troubles and from personal engagement with Bosnia since the war in the 1990s. She asks, considering both Ireland and Bosnia are borders, are entities problems, are problems which have their roots, as you might put it, in borders, or as political entities or cultural entities, that this is essentially a source of division and an obstacle to the development of diverse societies, particularly in a wider European context. Emer Currie and Alan, would either of you like to say whether or not this kind of political reading of the situation in Ireland and Bosnia, that really they are intractable issues that are waiting there to be inflamed all the time because of the political structures?
I mean, I suppose I will say this. I think whilst, you know, certainly as the peace process started to gather momentum and we had the Good Friday Agreement and the Joint Committee, the Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland meeting up and having discussions and stuff like that, you know, I really think that the border was becoming less of an issue. You know, that we were having fantastically good relationships, both north and south. And I think one of the consequences of Brexit is that, of course, it has put the border back onto the political agenda. And I think that that's something that I really do regret. I mean, I don't live in a border area, but yes, I mean, I think the border has always been something that has been problematic in Northern Ireland. But I do think that, you know, certainly in the last few years, it was becoming less of an issue, and I think people had accepted. Apart from, you know, obviously dissident Republicans that probably will never accept anything other than their own sort of, you know, warped ideology of what they want to see here. But I think for most people, they had accepted that, look, you know, the border question will be sorted when the time was right by a referendum, and that's. But I think Brexit has probably damaged that to some extent.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? Fardus, do you think that problems which are framed in terms of territorial division and entities which want to be independent of the greater political surroundings that they're in, are we just fated to have ongoing war and conflict in those areas?
No, well, I would disagree. I mean, I think we can't take that defeatist attitude. I think we're living at the times in the age where we are very much empowered through technology, through education, and I think we owe it to ourselves and our future generations to work together to resolve those issues. But I also think it's important for EU to work on building on this EU identity, because I think while we need to acknowledge our ethnic identities, we also, if we are seen as European, it would transcend those, if you like, geographical identities, and it would provide a unifying ground for all of us. And I think for that, really, EU has probably failed many of us to date, because I think they need to do and can do much more to build this unified, strong European identity. But it's certainly for the survival of EU, it would be quite important. So I think we need to celebrate our own kind of ethnic and nation belonging to nations, but at the same time, we have to go beyond that and really see the things that unify us. And looking from psychological point of view as well, oftentimes when things impact us, regardless of our ethnicities or nations, we have to get united. So, for instance, look at COVID. Suddenly we are across, regardless if you're living in the north of Ireland or south of Ireland, you know, we're all suffering in the same way, and we have similar issues to combat. But if we come together, we are much stronger in tackling those issues. So I think it's sometimes we have to also focus on things that we can do together as a civic society and as Europeans, and to look beyond our kind of the differences.
Now, thank Fardus. Thank you very much. Leslie Stock says he completely gets where Joe and Alan are coming from when they say they've been called traitors and so on. As a former RUC officer now involved in True Narratives organization with former Republican activists, I have had the same with former colleagues. I think the main thing should be the conviction of your heart and the extreme need to see others in a human way. I think the only answer to that is what I'm seeing, you know, thumbs up from Joe, and I don't think there would be any dissent from that. So I'm afraid that's almost all we've time for. This has been the third annual Una O'Higgins O'Malley Lecture. Before we wind up, it's my pleasure to invite our guest speaker, Joe Berry, to make a few closing remarks.
Thank you. It would have been amazing to have been with you all in person, and that was my dream. But this has also been incredibly special and such an honor to be sharing this talk with all of you on the panel. Everyone on the panel has phenomenal story and doing amazing work. And I'm absolutely sure that everyone who's listening also is making great contribution to peace in their own lives. And this gives me great heart, great hope, great courage, because together we are stronger and we can reach out to each other in kindness and support. And my dream is that our politicians also take on this unbounded empathy, this taking risks, the vulnerability, the reaching out, the speaking for the other community, the trying to give that empathy to walk in their shoes. And my belief is that despite the trauma that we all feel in our communities, in ourselves and what we've inherited, we can create a more just world, a world where everyone is seen in their full humanity, where human rights are completely respected, where there's dignity for all, where everybody has enough food and a house, and everybody is safe to practice their religion, safe to walk out of the door. And this world based on love and compassion and empathy, I had that vision as a child, and now it's stronger than ever. But of course, it's grown over the years. I now know much more about the kind of pain that would stop that happening. But my commitment is carry on and doing everything I can to spread love and empathy and to acknowledge the incredible humanity of everyone. So thank you.
Joe Berry. It only remains for me to thank the Glen Cree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation for hosting this annual lecture in its new incarnation of Zoom. None of the proceedings would have been possible without the support of the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund, which is now in its 7th year. On behalf of the Glen Cree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation and commemorating Una O'Higgins O'Malley, I say Ihawa, good night from Dublin.